you're the only, you sitting there are the only expert who, in a huge hall of people who don't know much about this blockchain Bitcoin bubble. So, remember, we're not here, we're somewhere else. Everybody here, almost everybody here, has at least heard of this magical currency called Bitcoin. Maybe not all of you have heard of something called blockchain, which is one of the important pieces of Bitcoin. As I'll explain, decentralization is central to the appeal of blockchain and of Bitcoin. In fact, in the way I'm going to tell this story, I'm at the center of the story since I was present at the creation of the blockchain. Along with a colleague, I wrote the first papers that amounted to the invention of the blockchain. So let's go to the beginning of the story. It's the fall of 1989, and I was a researcher at Bell Communications Research, the Bell Labs of the local phone companies, which was brand new, or almost brand new at the time. I was a researcher in cryptography, the science and engineering of protecting information, keeping it secret if it should be secret, and making sure it doesn't change if it shouldn't change. I've been there a couple years. A new guy came in, his name was Stuart Haber, and he came to me and proposed that we tackle the problem of how to securely timestamp digital documents. And in fact, that's when we did solve the problem, or came up with a reasonable solution, that was the title of our paper, which appeared in 1990 at the conference called Crypto, the most prestigious conference in the field of cryptography. So by digital document, we meant, of course, here I'll just say it's a bit string, any string of bits at all representing business records, lab notebook, financial transaction, and so on. And all of these files are easy to modify. Even in 1989, or back in 1989, it was clear that all of the world's records were moving online. In 1989, it wasn't, hadn't exactly happened yet, but it was clearly moving in that direction. Available cryptographic techniques pointed to a straightforward solution to the problem of timestamping digital documents. I'll jump away from the general audience and just say hash and sign timestamping. That solution uses a single trusted entity to certify the authenticity of strings of bits. That corresponds in the real world to trusting your marriage license to City Hall, your driver's license to the accursed Department of Motor Vehicles, or a bank for the balance of your checking account. But this solution was unsatisfactory to Sternetta and me because a single central entity is what security people call a single point of failure, one that could be bribed, corrupted, or hacked. Could we do better? Yes, we could. So here's my 3 or 4 minute animation of how the blockchain actually works. So I'll start with a metaphor. There is, as it were, a way to take the fingerprint of any digital file, any record. That's a good metaphor because the fingerprint of a file is small, no matter what the size of the file. It gives no information about the file, just like my fingerprint gives you no information about how tall I am, the color of my hair, whether I have any hair. The fingerprint is characteristic of the file. If you take several identical copies of the same file and take the fingerprint of each copy, you get identical fingerprints. And most important of all, the fingerprint is unique to the file. Here's where I'm lying, of course. But I'll get to that. If you take two different files, no matter what they are, even if they're the same file except for one single bit, their fingerprints differ wildly and unpredictably. So now I'll show you how Stuart and I turned this fingerprinting process into a solution to the time-stamping problem that we posed ourselves and built a blockchain. In fact, our solution to this was spun out of Belcore as a company to commercialize our time-stamping process. So here's how it worked. We would get time-stamping requests from customers consisting of the fingerprints of the respective of the records they wanted to register with us. We would group these requests into units that now I'll call blocks. We would take the requests in a block and boil them down into a single fingerprint that encapsulated all of the records in the block, resulting in a single fingerprint that can be unforgeably linked to each of the records in the block. Records keep coming in. We do the same thing to a second block, boil it down to a single fingerprint, but link it to the previous block, and so on. A third block, a fourth block. And then every so often, for example, once a week, we would take the entire week's worth of records and boil them down to a single summarizing fingerprint that encapsulates the entire week of transactions, and because of the linking, the entire history of the transactions up to that moment. Now, this was commercially deployed already in 1995. We were a single time-stamping entity. How did we guarantee worldwide consensus on the value of that fingerprint? We wanted to make that fingerprint a widely witnessed, widely witnessable, widely verifiable event. And the internet community in 1995 was rather smaller than it is now. And there are many fewer people actually interested in guaranteeing integrity of records. So what we did was we put that fingerprint in an advertisement in the national edition of the Sunday New York Times once a week, every week. Now that process, that weekly placement of an ad in the New York Times continues to this very day. Here I am standing at last summer's crypto conference holding the most recent New York Times. Let's zoom in on that. There's an ad in the New York Times that has a hash value, a number, every bit of which depends on every bit of all the time-stamping requests received by Surety, as our company was called, since it was deployed in 1995. Here is the New York Times as delivered to my apartment in New York. This, if you're old enough, this is called the subway fold. There's the ad from last Sunday. Go out and buy the Times today. You can see today's. I want this back. All right, so now the story jumps ahead a few years. It was just a couple months ago. Well, 3 or 4 months ago, we celebrated the 10-year anniversary of the appearance of Bitcoin with this wonderful paper by a cryptographer, economist, writer, code writer named Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever he is, she was, they were. Now, that completely does away with the central and centralizing role of banks. Now, as in any financial system, Satoshi needed a way to guarantee the integrity of the transactions in the system. That is, to make sure that if I promise you 17 Bitcoin, you can't turn around and change that into a promise that I send you 1,700 Bitcoin or 17 Bitcoin cents or millionths of a cent. In order to do that, Satoshi used the timestamping system, the data structure, the blockchain, though Satoshi didn't call it blockchain, which I just explained to you. There's the three of the 8 references in there, one of which is just a completely standard textbook, a good one for probability and statistics. Now, banks are not the only centralizing institutions whose records we depend on for various things. By now, of course, the blockchain data structure has been suggested for record-keeping projects of all kinds, some of them foolish, some of them worthwhile. I'll just give a couple of examples. This is a project for supplying a digital identity to anybody who wants one, particularly directed at the more than 1 billion people on the planet who can't depend on a national ID because of political chaos or a natural disaster, or worse, both happening simultaneously in the same place. Another kind of record is the pile of records that go with the global supply chain for shipping objects, physical things from one place to another. The contents of containers, customs certification, and so on. IBM, to name one small company, has a big project about that. But it's not only humongous shipping containers and big companies. Do you wonder about the source of the fish you had for dinner? Maybe you can assume, or there are projects here for doing this kind of thing. Soon you'll be able to trace that fish from its source all the way to your plate. Circling back to the beginning there, I've spent some time recently working on a project to give cryptographic verifiability to regular reporting of business records. So, lo these many years later, turns out that asking a pointed question about decentralizing the guarantees of integrity of digital records can upend all sorts of central institutions. I'm excited. All right, end of TED Talk. Now it's a TEDx talk. Let's get a little more technical. What about this fingerprinting process? So here's a more formal definition of the properties that I explained metaphorically using in terms of fingerprinting. When theoretically minded cryptographers give a talk about a system, they say, well, let H be a function instantiated in code that has these magical properties. This is a lot to ask for a function because what mathematicians of a certain sort call the pigeonhole principle assures you that there are lots and lots of pairs for any function whose argument, whose compressing bit strings to fixed length bit strings, there are lots of collisions, as they're called. That is, lots of pairs of documents, X and X prime, with the same hash value. So, do secure hash functions, that is, hash functions with these magical properties, actually exist? And here I want to point out that knowledge in the field of cryptography is very different from knowledge in certain other areas of science and engineering. We feel fairly safe in this building. You all feel safe sitting right here, knowing there are tons of concrete and metal and who knows what else sitting above your head. Why is that? Because this building was built according to scientific and engineering principles that we know to be true. In cryptography, we don't know anything. The protocols and that secure your payments, your communication, and so on, are based on assumptions that we do not know to be true. By the way, does anybody recognize the name William Goldman? You know why I wrote it down here? He's a great American screenwriter. Some people call him the inventor of many of the conventions of the way the movies work. In the movie-making business, one of the most important questions is this story, is this outline of the story, is it going to be a hit? Is it going to make money? And within the movie business, Goldman is who wrote many hit movies, but he's very famous for saying, nobody knows anything. And that's true about cryptographic assumptions. Mm-hmm. For example, the assumption that a certain algorithm instantiating a function called, for example, SHA-256, has those magical properties that I just outlined. Well, what can you do if they don't exist? Well, don't give up entirely. Because, in fact, at any given time, a secure hash function does exist, only temporarily. It's a pretty safe bet that right now, nobody anywhere on the planet has two bit strings with the same SHA-256 hash value. I would have said, I more or less did say, and in fact built a system using SHA-1, which is an earlier standard hash function, a while ago. So attacks on hash functions get better. What's the right way to swap in a new hash function to an already running integrity system? So let's make here's a concrete puzzle. So suppose you created this document 10 years ago, and you, let's see, if it was exactly 10 years ago, Bitcoin code was running somewhere, but did anybody in this room actually run Bitcoin exactly 10 years ago?
Why would they say that?
Okay, but so, my timestamping service was not exactly thriving, but running 10 years ago. Suppose you timestamped your document 10 years ago, and you got a timestamp certificate, and let's say the timestamping service used a particular hash function, H. Now, attacks on hash functions advance sort of incrementally. So let's say you hear that NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, has a new hash function, which they have standardized, and maybe it's better, H prime. And your favorite timestamping service offers its timestamping service with H prime, if that's what you ask for. How can you use the timestamping service when instantiated with H prime in order to update or renew integrity provided by your 10-year-old certificate. You want to buttress the security for the proof of your important document from 10 years ago. What do? Suggestions?
Append the old hash document and hash new function with the new hash function.
All right, so hold on. One thing you might do, so here, stating it again, you want to update your old certificate. So one thing you might do is submit a timestamp request using H prime, using the new hash function, and there you go. Well, that doesn't actually solve your problem. Your document's 10 years old. Getting a certificate for this week is fine, but it's secure now. But you've completely lost any link to its creation 10 years ago when you, if the old hash function is attacked. So, I heard hash to hash. So something you might do is timestamp the old certificate using the new hash function right now. What's wrong with this? What's wrong? So in fact, that first, how to timestamp a digital document, Sternetta and I proposed this solution in the paper, and we didn't realize that it's got a dumb mistake in it. Went right through the conference committee for crypto. It was a few months later, it was in the Journal of Cryptology. Referees didn't notice this. They didn't notice because people weren't paying attention. People didn't really care. Oh well, we didn't have a proof. But what's wrong with this solution?
The colliding document is still valid, right? And so you can put a fork to it.
Exactly. That's why you said to hash both,
Yeah,
presumably.
well, you have to append the hash to the old document.
So here's the problem. Remember, I want, the way I stated this puzzle, you have this 10-year-old timestamp certificate. You want to keep the link to the old, to the creation time and the certification of that, and not be screwed up by a completely devastating attack a few years from now. So the point is, what if a devastating attack, that is one that can easily find collisions, the only link between your document and this proposed updated solution, that is getting a certificate for the old certificate, is its hash value by the old hash function. So anybody who finds a collision, an X prime that collides with your 10-year-old X a few years from now, can claim, with without fear of being contradicted, that the colliding document is certified in this way. So what you need to do is timestamp the concatenation of the old certificate and the original and the document. You have to touch every bit again. Now you are protected. There's a slightly fishy assumption there, which is I'm assuming that in fact at the moment right now when I do this proposed updating proposal, nobody actually nobody knows anything about how to attack hash function H. But this is a fishy assumption, but it's actually the best you can do. And it's not so fishy because, in fact, I used to comfortably say this about this, that attacks on hash functions come bit by bit. They're sort of incremental attacks. So well before a completely devastating attack is known, there's plenty of time to do this swap in a new hash function operation. Of course, when I started speaking that way, there were no standing billions of dollars worth of target available for hash function attacks. But it still seems reasonably plausible there that you can swap in a new hash function. So what's the right way to do this in a system like Bitcoin? I'm not quite sure. Any questions?